The cheapest foods that kept medieval people alive were not chosen for taste, nutrition, or variety. They were chosen out of necessity. In a world where wealth was scarce and survival uncertain, food was less about enjoyment and more about endurance. For the majority of the population, especially peasants, labourers, and the urban poor, daily meals were shaped by what could be grown easily, stored cheaply, or acquired with minimal cost. These foods formed the backbone of survival in an age marked by harsh winters, frequent famine, and limited agricultural technology. At the centre of this survival diet was bread. Bread was not just a food, it was life itself. For the poor, it was often made from coarse grains like barley, rye, or oats, rather than the refined wheat enjoyed by the wealthy. These darker, heavier loaves were dense and sometimes bitter, but they were filling and relatively inexpensive to produce. In many households, bread accounted for the majority of daily calories. It was eaten at every meal, sometimes soaked in water or broth to soften its hardened crust. As days passed, stale bread became tougher, yet it was never wasted. Hunger ensured that even the hardest loaf remained valuable. Alongside bread, pottage served as another essential survival food. Pottage was a thick stew-like mixture made by boiling whatever ingredients were available in a pot over an open fire. This could include grains, vegetables, and occasionally scraps of meat. It was endlessly adaptable, which made it perfect for poor households. A single pot could simmer for days, with new ingredients added whenever something became available. This continuous cooking method stretched limited resources and allowed families to extract every bit of nourishment from even the smallest quantities of food. The taste was often bland, but it was warm, filling, and dependable. Vegetables played a crucial role in sustaining medieval populations, particularly those that were easy to grow and store. Cabbage was one of the most common, thriving in cold climates and lasting long after harvest. It could be boiled, added to pottage, or fermented to extend its shelf life. Onions and leeks were equally valuable, providing flavour to otherwise dull meals while being cheap and hardy crops. Turnips, another staple, grew quickly and could survive poor soil conditions. These root vegetables became especially important during the winter months when fresh food was scarce. They were not glamorous, but they were reliable. In times of extreme poverty, people turned to even more desperate measures. Wild plants, often overlooked in better times, became crucial sources of sustenance. Nettles, for example, could be gathered from fields and forests and cooked into soups. Though they stung when touched, boiling removed their sting and made them edible. Dandelion leaves, wild garlic, and sorrel were also foraged and consumed. These plants required no cost other than the effort to find them, making them invaluable during famine or hardship. However, foraging came with risks. Mistaking a poisonous plant for an edible one could have deadly consequences. Grains beyond bread also played a significant role in survival. Oats, for instance, were commonly used to make porridge. This simple dish required only water and grain, making it one of the cheapest meals possible. It was often eaten in the morning to provide energy for long days of physical labour. Barley, another affordable grain, was used in both food and drink. Barley water and thin gruels were common among the poor, offering hydration and minimal nutrition. While these meals lacked variety, they were effective in keeping hunger at bay. Protein was much harder to come by for the lower classes. Meat was expensive and often reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. However, small amounts of protein could sometimes be obtained through alternative means. Beans and legumes were among the cheapest and most accessible sources. Peas, lentils, and broad beans could be dried and stored for long periods, making them a valuable addition to the medieval diet. When cooked into pottage, they added both substance and a modest amount of nutrition. Occasionally, the poor might gain access to scraps of meat, often the parts that wealthier individuals did not want. Offal, organs such as liver, kidneys and heart, was cheaper than prime cuts and therefore more accessible. While these parts were less desirable, they were rich in nutrients and could be used to enhance otherwise bland meals. Bones were also highly valued, not for the small bits of meat clinging to them, but for the broth they could produce. Boiling bones for hours created a thin soup that could be shared among many, stretching resources even further. Fish provided another source of protein, particularly in regions near rivers or coastal areas. Small, inexpensive fish such as herring were commonly consumed, often salted or dried to preserve them. Preservation was essential, as fresh fish spoiled quickly. Salted fish became a staple during certain times of the year, especially during religious fasting periods when meat was restricted. While not always plentiful, fish offered a crucial dietary supplement when available. Dairy products, though not always abundant, also contributed to survival. Milk could be consumed fresh, but it spoiled quickly, so it was often turned into cheese or butter to extend its usability. For the poor, cheese was typically hard and simple, lacking the refinement of wealthier varieties. Still, it provided a valuable source of fat and protein. Even a small piece of cheese could make a significant difference in an otherwise meager meal. In urban areas, survival food took on a slightly different form. Those living in towns and cities often lacked access to land for growing their own food, making them reliant on markets or charity. Street food vendors sold inexpensive items such as bread, pies filled with low-quality ingredients, and thin soups. These foods were not always safe or nutritious, but they were accessible. Begging and reliance on alms were also common among the poorest, highlighting the fragile nature of survival in medieval society. Famine was an ever-present threat that shaped eating habits across all levels of society. When crops failed due to poor weather, disease, or war, food supplies dwindled rapidly. Prices soared, and even basic foods became difficult to obtain. During these times, people resorted to extreme measures. Bread might be made from alternative ingredients such as acorns or bark, despite their unpleasant taste and limited nutritional value. Such substitutions were signs of desperation, reflecting the lengths to which people would go to avoid starvation. Preservation techniques played a vital role in ensuring that cheap foods could last as long as possible. Drying, salting, and fermenting were among the most common methods. These techniques allowed surplus food from harvest seasons to be stored for the winter months. Without refrigeration, preservation was essential for survival. Even then, supplies often ran low before the next harvest, leading to periods known as the Hungry Gap, when food was scarce and diets became even more limited. The psychological impact of such a diet should not be overlooked. Eating the same simple foods day after day with little variation could be monotonous and disheartening. Yet, for many, there was no alternative. Hunger shaped not only what people ate, but how they viewed food itself. Every crumb was valuable, every meal uncertain, waste was unthinkable, and gratitude for even the smallest portion was a necessity. Despite these hardships, medieval communities often found ways to support one another. Shared cooking, communal ovens, and mutual aid helped families stretch their resources. In some cases, religious institutions provided food to the poor, offering a small measure of relief. These acts of cooperation were essential in a world where individual survival was often precarious. Ultimately, the cheapest foods that kept medieval people alive were defined by simplicity, availability, and resilience. Bread, pottage, vegetables, grains, and occasional scraps of protein formed a diet that was far from luxurious but sufficient to sustain life. These foods tell a story of endurance in the face of constant uncertainty. They reflect a time when survival depended not on abundance, but on making the most of what little was available. To modernize, such a diet may seem harsh and unappealing. Yet, it was this very simplicity that allowed millions to survive in a challenging and unpredictable world. The ingenuity and resourcefulness of medieval people turned the most basic ingredients into sustenance. In doing so, they demonstrated a profound understanding of survival, one that required not comfort or choice, but determination and resilience.